everyone, I'm Lindsay Lewis, editor of Building Enclosure. Thanks for listening along with us today. Today I'm joined by Daniel Overbey, an assistant professor of architecture at Ball State University and an associate principal and director of sustainability for Browning Day in Indianapolis. We're also joined by Annie Koch, a project manager at Energy Studio. Annie specializes in technical assessments of high performance and zero net energy buildings. Dan and Annie are here today to talk about all things net zero. Mostly, we'll be talking about the concept of getting to net zero before the RFP, including questions to ask before writing an RFP and how project teams can approach net zero energy while working on a project. Dan and Annie, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So we hear the term net zero energy a lot. So how do we define this term?
Well, Annie, you want to take that one?
Yes, I am happy to take that one because it is tricky. There are a lot of ways to define it, and that's one of the important things to start out with your project is to make sure you and the team are defining it the same way. So NREL, that's the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, they have clear definitions that you can work from for site energy, source energy, cost, emissions. Like there are lots of different ways that you can have net zero energy classified through them. But your general description, what most people go with is site zero net energy, where you're looking at your building reducing its energy consumption enough that it can produce enough energy on site to meet that demand on an annual basis. And that's the typical go-to for it. If you're wrapping in source energy, then you're factoring in the amount of energy that's lost in transition from where the energy is being created. So at your utility facilities and then the transfer process, emissions, and you're looking at obviously what kind of emissions that energy is going to be having, and cost. Everyone likes to wrap in cost. So first of all, understanding what your team is understanding that definition to be, make sure you're all on the same page, and knowing what the owner's goals are and how to drive that for your project is really important.
Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
I would only add that the very last thing that Annie mentioned is, I think, what I would build off of in terms of a general approach, that whichever of these definitions applies to a project situation, you always want to start off with those goals, with analyzing the project, defining the goals. We'll move on from there to a process with an integrative team approach by which we look at a variety of energy conservation measures. Some might regard the enclosure, some might be with regard to the HVAC system, the lighting, just all aspects of the project, working on really systems-wide, how we can integrate, strike synergies, try to make the structure as energy efficient as possible, as high performing as possible. And then the last piece, if you take something like the first definition that Annie mentioned with net zero site energy, or maybe the net zero source energy, where you're going to have some component of on-site renewable energy production, that actually comes last. That on-site piece that's going to do the energy generation, which is always so emblematic and something you can point to as just representing what the project stands for. That's dollar for dollar, the most expensive piece, and you want to do that last. You want to put yourself in a situation where that on-site system is as small as possible, as cost-effective as it can be. And we approach this by bringing disciplines to the table as early as we can on any project and working on finding those pathways, finding those synergies, and going just beyond ideas and hypotheses toward actually leveraging really robust, engaging tools across different disciplines to make better informed design decisions.
So at Building Enclosure, we talk about standards a lot. Can you talk maybe about construction standards that come into play during the design process?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'll use that as a precursor to get into what Annie and I would talk about in terms of 5 different realms of information. If you are driving toward a net zero project, and the title of this episode being how do you get to net zero before the RFP, that's kind of a hook. We're talking about making a building high performing, and it may or may not be before the RFP that you do this, but what we're really talking about is providing some level of clarity in the owner's project requirements, that what the owner puts into the project requirements that everybody must respond to and achieve, that really sets a team up for success. That's something that the different disciplines on a design team can leverage to make certain conversations happen and achieve very specific outcomes with regard to energy, high performance, some definition of net zero, et cetera. And those 5 realms would be design and construction standards, budgetary constraints, plug and process loads, renewables, and accountability. So when we talk about design and construction standards, we get back to that OPR, that owner's project requirement. And we would ask, does the OPR identify a set performance standard? Because we've seen sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. If the answer is yes, we would want to know if it's a standalone design and construction standard or if it's part of a comprehensive standard that takes a more holistic approach to sustainability and the facility. You may or may not have some aspect of measuring, of some kind of metering, benchmarking taking place. And the design construction standard will address that squarely, or at least it should. Sometimes we see with those standards, it's something that's developed internally and sometimes it's externally. A great example of an external would be if you said that there's a LEED standard or that you're going to meet ASHRAE standard 90.1 of some edition, that's going to be developed through some kind of a third party. And that's going to probably take some kind of a consensus development model, and it's going to have a predictable update cycle. And we talk about hitching your cart to a horse. And if it's the horse of LEED or an ASHRAE standard, it's going to keep just marching down the road, and it's going to get updated with some kind of a frequency, and it's going to take you someplace. If you do an internal standard, if we're talking about a design and construction standard that is internal to an enterprise, that on one hand would allow for that enterprise to have the greatest amount of control over scope and procedures, but you also want to be careful about making it predictable. And I'm really talking to anyone who might represent ownership right now or represent one of these said enterprises, that is their staff empowered, maybe directed to make updates with some kind of regularity, that it doesn't just go on a shelf, because we'll see this happen from time to time. There's a champion internally. That person develops this standard and it's great in the moment, but then that leader that helped develop it was so great at their job that they move up to some other position, and then this thing just goes on a shelf. Next thing you know, your standards becoming antithetical to what it was initially set to do. And so that's really the role, that standard, Lindsay, just what you said as the minimum standard, whether it's LEED, ASHRAE, something internal, can really set a project on a very specific course.
So, Annie, Dan mentioned some budgetary constraints. Maybe can you possibly name some budgetary considerations that teams should be aware of?
So yes, there are budgetary constraints that everyone needs to be factoring in if you really want to be successful at having a net zero design. Design is going to take a little bit longer. You're going to have extra energy modeling that you're going to have to be doing, and modifications to design. You're going to have extra costs associated with the equipment needed at the building. But the important component here is not to balk at the added costs, because if you look at the life cycle cost analysis for what is going to be occurring for your building, your return on investment is going to improve the overall return on investment for your building. If you're looking at certain measures that might be more expensive at the initial design, and then you look 10 years out, all of a sudden your operational costs have decreased so much that you'll overcome that added cost from design and the added cost from the initial cost for your equipment and your building components.
So I guess going back to the main reason we're here today, how can a project team approach net zero energy on a project?
It's a great question. I mentioned earlier an integrative process, and it's this notion just conceptually that you're going to bring all the disciplines to the table early. It's this classic McLeamy curve where we're trying to shift the effort where everybody brings their ideas to the table to much earlier in the process, and that you try to strike some synergies and you look for opportunities to bring these together. But also, what Annie and I both would advocate would be to bring in energy modeling, some of these robust tools to go beyond these designer rules of thumb and actually testing ideas and going beyond the assumptions toward making better informed design decisions backed up by the rigors of some performance analysis. And that might sound to some in the audience like, oh, great, I don't disagree with that idea, but how in the world do we define that? I'm used to having the energy modeler on my project do this thing, maybe a check halfway through the design process, and then maybe wrap it up at the end and do it for my jurisdictional energy code compliance or for LEED, something like that. What we would advocate for is to bring in a more robust framework that's going to actually leverage these tools for energy modeling to make it really a part of the decision making through the development of a project, that it will help you test ideas, optimize solutions, go beyond those rules of thumb, proceed with more confidence. In a lot of ways, it becomes something like a cost estimate that we would work on with a project. So many assumptions that are unknown at the earlier stages of a process when you're designing a project. As you move through the development process, you're going to have more detail. Assumptions will become known. Things that weren't so clarified will become clarified, and you'll be able to sharpen your pencil, have a more accurate depiction, more accuracy, more confidence with the cost. It's the same thing with energy modeling. In fact, Annie, I'll throw to you to talk about 209. I think that's a perfect segue.
Yeah, so thank you, Dan. In ASHRAE's standard 209, it spells out all the different types of energy modeling that can occur throughout a project. For those that aren't very familiar with energy modeling, it's easy to think, like Dan was saying, that there's just like, a model that you do at the end that wraps up exactly what's occurring in the design. So you have an estimate of your percent savings, if it's energy savings or cost savings, that you have that in a clear method. But there's actually like, I don't know, a dozen or different ways that you can use your energy modeling efforts to make decisions throughout the process. I was just working on a project that was really early on. They were doing like a site analysis and they weren't sure how to use their energy modeling, but they had me come on so early that I was able to run different iterations. They're doing like a campus approach. So I was testing out different orientations for various buildings they were going to have on the site and ways that they could optimize the window placements for natural ventilation and daylighting. And like even before you're thinking about any of the mechanical side of things, really getting in on those early design decisions that become cost prohibitive to change the further you get along in the design process. If you all of a sudden are working on your model and you're in CD, like your construction design, and you're too far along to be able to make certain changes in like a cost-effective manner, and also time. Like time is so valuable here, and if you want to start making changes too late, it's going to be really impossible, and a lot of people are going to be angry with like going back and redoing work. So being able to have clear communication with your energy modeler, with the design team. So having goals set by the owner is fantastic, but also having communication with the energy modeler, with the architecture team, and with the electrical team and the mechanical team, so that they can let the modeler know what are the parameters that they're working within, what are certain design decisions that they're attempting to make at whatever stage you happen to be in. And we can run different simulations to figure out what is going to be the most energy efficient, what's the most cost efficient, what's the best for demand. Perhaps you have a building that's going to be off-site or off-grid, and you need to really be able to hone that in together as a team.
So it seems like decision making at the earliest stages can make such a huge impact. So how early can net zero be addressed on a project?
The earliest. As early as possible.
Right. That's what it seems like. Yeah.
It's really, it does so much good when we get a project brief or an owner's project requirement that says, and we just had this happen earlier this year, that says in no uncertain terms, this project has this for a budget, and it will be net zero energy by some definition, and we're going to get there. It is lifted up on par with the schedule and the project budget, that this performance outcome that it's set to achieve is that important. This unwavering, steadfast commitment to some kind of a definition of high performance design, of sustainability. Maybe it's a university client where they said it will be LEED Gold. No matter what you do, this will be LEED Gold. Well, that gives Annie and myself the opportunity to jump into some exchanges with the entire team and with ownership, and it will allow us to make conversations and decision making happen that might otherwise not happen, because under the pressures that we all feel every day on all of our projects with schedule and budget, these other limited resource capitals on a project, that you are going to also achieve these unwavering set benchmarks for the project's success. This, when you bring sustainability in a clearly defined, measurable manner on the same footing as the rest of those, it really puts a project team in a position to have that give and take. You know, I hear this sometimes, Lindsay, where someone will say, almost like a marketing angle, that, oh, we can do LEED Platinum for no added cost. Well, by definition, as Annie said earlier, if you do something that is beyond the minimum standard, beyond just whatever we're talking about as the baseline performance system, you're going with some kind of a premium system that's maybe ahead of what the market normally has right now, and it's going to come with a cost. But when you take that same integrative team approach that you're applying in other regards, if you also take it to the budget and you're saying, okay, this is my project budget, this is my dollars per square foot, whatever it may be, there can be a give and a take. That's how you do something like net zero or LEED Platinum or what have you. That's how you do it without any added cost. And your listeners can't hear me using air quotes right now, but it really just means that there's a give and a take with the dollars and cents, that you're saying, okay, I'm going to back off on this other quality of my design solution so that I can make sure that I achieve my unwavering sustainability objectives within the budget, because I'm going to be able to afford this other premium HVAC system and on-site renewables, et cetera. So that all comes with that integrative team approach. That all comes from, at the earliest stages, you're getting all the disciplines to the table. But even before all of that, it requires that type of just steadfast commitment by leadership, by ownership. When the OPR comes out, when the FRP is out there, you're getting the request for proposal, and you know going in, we're going to take a shot at getting this project, and we know it's going to be net zero energy, net zero carbon. That is how you get there. It takes that's how you get there before the RFP, so to speak.
So, Dan, you touched this briefly, but I think it's worth asking again. How can this approach that we've been talking about be used on projects with other sustainability goals?
Well, we see it right now in a few different regards. One that comes to mind as you were describing that would be something like embodied carbon. That's another aspect to a bigger carbon picture. And much like Annie was describing with ASHRAE Standard 209, we'll also propose and endeavor to execute a framework within our workflow through which we will, at the earliest stages of design development, all the way through, hopefully all the way through procurement, with a little bit of verification through materials that were actually purchased for a project, is we will try to assess, and perhaps if we are able to, optimize for the carbon consequence of the enclosure, of the structure. And our industry is just now starting to develop a frame of reference for what the numbers even mean. And I scored this on my project. I ran some kind of a LCA tool, and I figured out an embodied carbon number. And is it a good number or a bad number? Nobody seems to be able to tell me for sure. Well, we're finally at the point where we can start to figure that out. Once you can start to develop that frame of reference, then here we go. Now we can set goals at the beginning of the project. Ownership can set goals at the outset and say, you're going to get within this range. And I think that's where we're going next. And the process looks a lot like what Annie was describing with 209.
And I'm just going to add into that as well. Like, a project can have extremely high goals of, your LEED Platinums, your zero net energy, all of the different things that you could be striving towards. But even if it's just the standard of like having a code compliance model as well, like buildings have to meet code. Depending on what state you're in, it's going to be a different level of scrutiny, but you can align the energy modeling efforts throughout the design process to get to code, have your like 10% better than code, or getting all the way to Z&E. But in both aspects, it's really beneficial to have those steps along the way to let you know, like, okay, we're on track for this. We need to modify this. Oh, you want to go for zero net energy? Did you notice that in your design you have natural gas stove tops in your kitchen? Like, we should probably talk about that. Like having those checkpoints along the way and make the scramble at the end a lot less painful.
Yeah, this is actually an aspect, Lindsay, that we talk about a lot. And we were talking about those 5 different realms on a pathway to net zero.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about design and construction standards and budgetary constraints, and we've even talked a little bit about renewables. But those other 2, and Annie, you started to talk about it, the plug and process loads, and just how immensely important that is, and the accountability are the other 2 that kind of round out that 5 that are going to make or break a project.
So quickly before we go, I'd love to ask you guys this. Are there any projects that you worked on recently where you've been able to get to net zero before the RFP?
Before the RFP? Well, there's plenty that have started before the RFP with that goal. I've been working on a handful of them. My favorite is a school that's in Southern California, and this was a project that I worked on like 8 years ago. And they absolutely went through that process and got there. And the reason that they did, where most people don't, is because of the commissioning after the fact, and really making sure you're monitoring your energy consumption throughout. That is like the most difficult component of this. Everyone can design a zero net energy building if you really try, but to have it be the design come through in the construction and then in the operations, and then lo and behold, then there's the people that are in there and what they do in that space, and really making sure that it comes full circle. And that's the tricky part.
Mm-hmm.
A good friend of mine, Peter Rumsey, had a stat for me one time that was really interesting. Said you got to give him credit for this stat. Said 9 out of 10 buildings in the commercial sector have some kind of an operational issue in the first year of operation. So what Annie's talking about, getting into not just the fundamental commissioning you need for, say, for a prerequisite for LEED or the enhanced, but to do that monitoring based commissioning. If you're doing a net zero project, that monitoring based commissioning, that kind of goes, Annie, along the lines of that accountability piece that you've talked about so often when we've talked about these issues in other venues. Just it helps you'll see in real time as you're trying to go through a performance period how a project is doing, and that I totally agree with what Annie offered there. That continuous monitorization is just extremely important.
And the longevity of interest in the project, because you have so much turnover, especially with how the economy has been in the past couple of years and people switching jobs a lot. It is difficult to hold on to what those initial goals were when you were in design. Because let's be realistic here. You start your design, it's going to take, depending on the type of project, you have a year or 2 of going through that, a year of construction. It takes a bit for it to get fully occupied, and then you have another year or so of doing a performance period if you want to go through that whole process. I mean, we're talking 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer if you have some really complex projects or difficulties that come up in between. That's a long time to assume that whoever set the original goals are still going to be there to help make sure they happen, and if there's still going to be money there. And so I was involved in a utility zero net energy pilot program where we're just getting to the stage now. I'm hearing from some of these projects that they're going through this process. It was in a previous role, so I'm not fully involved in it now. And it's interesting because there's so much turnover, and some of them who have had a little bit more of ownership buy-in and real like proper interest, they're the ones that are successful. The ones that have had a little bit more of a struggle of turnover and a struggle of occupancy, like those are the ones that it's like that just kind of gets cut out as you go through the process of like what are the priorities for them.
The project that we worked on about a decade ago was a small community library in southern Indiana for a population in town of about 500, and they wanted to put this little branch library next to an elementary school, but the library was going to allow it under two conditions. One, they couldn't afford to pay for the volunteers, or they couldn't pay for the staff, so it had to be staffed by volunteers. But secondly, they also could not afford to take on the financial burden of the utilities. And so it needed to be net zero. So there from the project outset, the only way this small branch library could come into existence is if the community was willing to staff it voluntarily, and then if it was going to be net zero site energy. And we were able to achieve that. But there was a situation where the only way this project could exist was through an unwavering commitment to net zero. And when we went into it, we knew that that had to be the outcome. And when everybody is committed to it at that level, guess what? We did it on the same budget that they would otherwise see for that type of a construction, that type of a branch library in that market at that time. So that was one of those, didn't cost us more. It did. It took a give and a take. That's what really happens there. But we were able to get there because we had to, and that made all the difference.
Well, thank you again, Dan and Annie, for your time today.
More than welcome, Lindsay. Yeah.
If anyone listening has any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Dan or Annie, and we'd love to continue the conversation. Until next time, visit us on buildingenclosureonline.com for all your technical and educational resources.